The silver Lexus caught my eye before anything else. Gleaming in the late afternoon sun, it sat parked at the edge of Dan's manicured driveway like it belonged there. But it didn't. That car was supposed to be in our garage, sitting quietly beside my dusty work truck. Margaret had no reason to be here. At least, none she'd mentioned this morning over coffee. I slowed the Honda, my mind already racing ahead of the moment. Maybe she'd stopped by to drop something off for Brianna. That would make sense. But Brianna wasn't home, she'd told me herself, just 20 minutes ago. "Sorry, Dad, I'm not home tonight. Dan's in, though. He's swamped with casework," she'd said, cheerful, unsuspecting. So why was my wife's car here? I drove past the house slowly, eyes fixed on that Lexus, pretending to scan the street for an address. Something clenched in my chest as I circled the block and pulled into a spot 2 houses down. I killed the engine and just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel like they didn't know what to do. The house looked normal enough. White shutters, neatly trimmed hedges. No signs of trouble. But something felt off, wrong, in that bone-deep way a man learns to trust after enough years of laying concrete and reading blueprints. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the side of the house, careful to stay in the shadow of the fence. I could hear voices. Muffled at first. A man's low tone, then a woman's laugh, light, familiar, too familiar. I moved closer, until I was just under the open window near the living room. "When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for." Margaret's voice. My wife's voice. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I pressed myself against the siding, every muscle taut. My heart was pounding so hard, I worried they might hear it through the wall. I couldn't see them, not yet. But I didn't need to. I knew that voice. I'd heard it whisper, "I love you," in the dark. I'd heard it comfort our daughter after nightmares. I'd heard it promise forever, again and again. Now it was plotting mine. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone, swiping it into record mode with shaking fingers. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew I had to hear it. I had to know the truth, even if it tore everything apart. And as I stood outside my son-in-law's home, listening to the 2 people I trusted most dismantle my life, one word kept echoing through my skull: war. I edged toward the window, moving slowly, carefully, like a man approaching the edge of a crumbling cliff. The curtains were only half drawn, swaying gently in the breeze. Through the small opening, I could see the living room, Brianna's living room, and there they were. Margaret sat cross-legged on the couch, calm as Sunday morning, flipping through a file like she was reviewing a recipe book. Dan leaned against the bookshelf, sleeves rolled up, his tie loose around his neck. He looked too comfortable, too at home. My fingers tightened around the phone in my pocket. "The timeline's perfect," Dan was saying. His voice had that cold, professional sharpness I'd always admired. "We file in June. Irreconcilable differences. Under the new Iowa statutes, she gets half, plus lifelong spousal support." Margaret laughed. That same delicate, tinkling laugh I used to fall asleep beside. Now it sounded like nails on glass. "The construction business alone is worth $12 million. Add in the rentals, the lake house, investments, we're looking at $20 million, easy." I felt like I'd been shoved into a different reality. I watched her sip from a wine glass, white wine, her favorite, and nod like this was just another dinner plan. She tapped her perfectly manicured nail on the folder sitting between them. "All of it," she said. "And he'll never see it coming. I've been playing the loving wife for 2 years straight, listening to him ramble about payroll and weather delays. Smiling? Pretending." My knees buckled slightly. I caught myself on the edge of the siding, breath shallow. I wanted to kick the door in. Scream. Demand to know how long this had been going on. But I didn't. I stayed quiet. I kept listening. "The best part," Dan continued, "is he gave us everything we need. Bank statements, asset reports, all just sitting on his desk." My hand shook. I thought of every dinner where I talked about budgets and projections, thinking I was being transparent, being a good husband. I thought I was building a legacy. Margaret raised her glass. "To the old fool," she said, smiling. That was me. I was the fool. A twig snapped under my foot. They froze. "Did you hear that?" Margaret's voice tightened. Dan paused, listening. "Probably just the neighbor's cat." I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart slamming against my ribs. My mind was spinning, but one thing was crystal clear now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a bad week or some midlife confusion. This was betrayal. Calculated, cold, and very, very real. My thumb hovered over the screen for a split second before I hit record. The red light blinked once, then settled steady. Every instinct told me to storm through that door, demand answers, tear the lies apart with my bare hands. But I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just listened. Inside, the two of them were back to talking, more carefully now, quieter, but still clear enough to catch every syllable through the open window. "Alan's predictable," Dan said, his voice a shade lower, but still smug. "He trusts you completely. He's not going to question you reviewing paperwork. Hell, he probably thinks you're helping him." Margaret gave a soft laugh, softer this time, almost sad if I didn't know better. "Do you know how many times I've nodded through his boring little updates? Pretended to care about subcontractors and inspection deadlines? I even sat through that payroll crisis last fall like it mattered to me." "Convincing performance," Dan muttered. "I deserved an Oscar," she replied. My mouth went dry. For 25 years, I thought we were a team. Through rough years, lean seasons, long nights. I thought we were working towards something, family, legacy, love. But she'd been playing a part. And I was the clueless audience. "You've been cataloging everything?" Margaret asked. "Every cent," Dan said. "I've got D copies, company valuations, bank account summaries. By the time we file, everything will be in place. There won't be time for him to react." My hand clenched around the phone. The bastard was planning to gut my life and call it legal strategy. My wife, the woman I put through college, the mother of my daughter, was complicit. No, not just complicit. She was the architect. "What about Brianna?" Margaret asked. "Do you think she'll take his side?" "Doesn't matter. You're entitled to what's yours. If he fights, we paint him as controlling. Financial manipulation, emotional abuse. The courts lean toward the narrative, not the facts." Margaret didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "He actually believes I still love him." That one hit different. Like a nail through the ribs. I had to look away for a second, force myself to breathe, to stay rooted to the spot. Inside, the conversation shifted, tactical, methodical, like they were planning a hostile takeover. Which, in a way, they were. 43 minutes. That's how long the recording lasted before the window slid shut. Long enough to lay bare their entire plan. Long enough to turn heartbreak into evidence. I slipped back to my car like a ghost, the phone still warm in my hand. My life had just collapsed in on itself. But somewhere inside the chaos, something else sparked. Not grief. Not yet. Resolve. The house looked the same when I pulled into the driveway. Clean siding, trimmed hedges, the damn fountain Margaret insisted on for our 20th anniversary gurgling like nothing had changed. But everything had. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel like they'd forgotten how to let go. Inside, the silence was heavy. Not peaceful. Hollow. I stood in the living room and looked around like I was seeing it for the first time. The mantel held our wedding photo. December 15, 1987. Margaret in ivory silk, eyes bright, holding my hand like she meant it. I'd built this house for her. Every board, every nail. I'd poured the foundation myself with a 3-man crew, working through snow and exhaustion because she wanted a 2-story with a wraparound porch. Back then, I thought love looked like labor. Like showing up, day after day, with a lunch pail and a promise. I thought if I worked hard enough, gave enough, stayed faithful and present, that it meant something. That it would be enough. The kitchen still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The table was empty, except for our 25th anniversary card from last December. Her handwriting looped elegant and clean in blue ink. "To my wonderful husband, thank you for making all my dreams come true. Here's to 25 more years of happiness. All my love, Margaret." I'd reread that line twice, all her love. What a goddamn performance. I wandered into Brianna's old room, still half filled with the relics of her childhood, soccer trophies, faded posters, a quilt Margaret sewed when she was pregnant. For a moment, I could see it all so clearly. Margaret rubbing her swollen belly, talking about paint colors and middle names. Her face lit up at parent-teacher nights. Birthday parties that looked like weddings. I used to watch her in those moments and think, she was made for this. But now I couldn't stop wondering if it had all been part of the act. Had she loved Brianna? Or was motherhood just another role, one more way to secure her place in the story? Had our anniversaries meant anything? The cruise to Alaska, her joy over glaciers and hot cocoa on the deck. Was that real? Or was she already counting what she'd walk away with if it all ended? The worst part wasn't that she'd stopped loving me. It was the dawning suspicion that maybe she never really had. 25 years of marriage, reduced to a strategy session between my wife and the man who married our daughter. I sat down in the recliner she always said clashed with the living room and stared into the dark, and for the first time in my life, I wondered if the biggest project I'd ever built, our marriage, had been a lie from the very first brick. They weren't expecting me. I pulled into the driveway like it was any other day, the engine humming steady beneath me. Margaret stepped out first, sunglasses perched on her head, designer bag slung over one arm. She froze when she saw me. Dan followed behind, adjusting his tie like he hadn't just spent the afternoon plotting to gut my life. Their expressions flickered for just a beat, shock, calculation, before the mask snapped into place. "Alan," Margaret said, her voice climbing half an octave too high. "What are you doing here?" I smiled, easy and practiced. "Finished up early at the job site down on Fulton. Thought I'd swing by and see Brianna." Dan stepped a little closer to her. Protective. Instinctive. His eyes scanned my face like he was looking for a crack in my story. He'd spent enough time in courtrooms to know when something wasn't quite right. But I'd spent 35 years negotiating with city inspectors, developers, union reps. I knew how to wear calm like armor. "She's not home," Margaret said quickly. "Just me and Dan. He's working on some legal stuff for a client, and I came by to help organize a few things." I gave a small nod. "Always knew you had a hidden talent for document prep." Dan laughed once, tight, forced. "Just wrapping up, actually. Divorce case. Very complex asset division." I caught that. The way he said divorce without blinking. He was daring me to flinch. I didn't. "Sounds intense," I said. "Margaret, didn't you say you had the Henderson proposal at work today? Weren't you supposed to be at the office till 6? She hesitated. Just a second. A hairline crack in her perfect delivery. "Left early. Headache." "Sorry to hear that," I said, then turned to Dan. "So complex divorce, huh? You must see all kinds of ugly in your line of work. Comes with the territory. I'll bet." I checked my phone casually, made sure they saw the screen. Neither of them reacted. But Dan's eyes flicked toward it for a moment too long. "Well," I said, slipping the phone back into my pocket, "I should head home. Dinner's not going to cook itself." "I'll be along shortly," Margaret offered. "Just need to finish up here." "Take your time." I turned toward my car, then stopped. "Oh, Margaret, Dr. Patterson's office called about rescheduling your physical. Said there was a conflict with your work calendar." Her face froze. Not for long, but just long enough. "I'll give them a call," she said quickly. "Must be a mix-up." "No worries." I climbed into the car, started the engine, and didn't look back until I hit the corner. In the rearview mirror, I saw them move together, whispering urgently. They thought they were still in control. They had no idea the real game had already begun. The door clicked shut behind me with a finality I hadn't felt before. The house was quiet again, too quiet. But this time, I welcomed the silence. No fake greetings, no hollow questions about my day, no carefully rehearsed affections. Just me and the echo of what I knew. I stood in the foyer for a moment, staring at the hallway that led to the office. For years, that room had been the nerve center of my life. Contract blueprints, payroll logs, tax records, client calls. Margaret used to joke it was where I married the business. Now, it was where I'd start the divorce she didn't see coming. The desk light flicked on, casting shadows across the oak walls. I sat down and opened the drawer on the left, pulling out a yellow legal pad. I didn't need to Google what to do. I'd built an empire out of steel, sweat, and straight lines. This was just another blueprint, only this time, it was personal. First, finances. I logged into every account, business and personal, and checked for activity. Transfers. Statements. Red flags. She'd been smart, I give her that. But not smart enough. She'd been gathering the obvious numbers. Surface-level wealth. Assets you can find in a quarterly report or a tax return. But the real gold? The structures I'd built to weather storms, not even Dan would think to look there. I had offshore arrangements through Marcus Webb, legal, above board, but discreet. Established long before Margaret even knew what a line of credit was. Second, paper trail. I opened the cabinet, pulled file after file, every business license, deed, trust, insurance policy. She thought she'd been quietly mapping out the kingdom, but she didn't know the keys weren't where she thought they were. And now, I'd make sure those doors stayed locked. I spent hours cataloging, highlighting, organizing, not as a man desperate to keep what was his, but as one who'd been underestimated. That was their mistake. By the time the clock hit midnight, the desk was covered in evidence. A war table built from betrayal. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the framed picture of Brianna on the shelf. High school graduation. She was smiling, arms around both of us. Margaret looked radiant, proud. I wondered now if she already knew back then how this would end. I wasn't going to lose everything I'd built. Not to a woman who had mistaken kindness for weakness, or to a lawyer who thought a suit and a few fancy words made him dangerous. This wasn't going to be a courtroom drama. It was going to be a dismantling. They had the element of surprise. Now I had everything else. The next morning, I shaved close and put on my navy suit. Not the one I wear to client meetings, the other one, darker, sharper. Margaret always said it made me look too serious. That suited me just fine. By 9 a.m., I was in Marcus Webb's office. He'd been my accountant for over 15 years, long before Cole Construction had more than 3 trucks and a dream. Marcus wasn't flashy. No fancy glass desk or modern art on the walls. Just a man who understood numbers better than most people understand language. He looked up as I walked in. "You're early." "Didn't sleep," I said, and closed the door behind me. He raised an eyebrow, then gestured for me to sit. I didn't waste time with small talk. "I need to secure the business, everything Margaret doesn't already know about." Quietly. Marcus blinked, then nodded slowly. He didn't ask questions. That's what made him good. "I remember you mentioned the offshore structure back in 2017, he said, pulling out a binder from his drawer. "It's clean, legal, fully documented, but invisible to anyone not digging deep." "She's not that thorough," I said. "But Dan might be." He nodded again. "We'll tighten it. Restructure the ownership under a separate holding company based out of Zurich. Trust controlled. Your name won't even touch the title until you're 65. I didn't flinch. "Do it." He tapped a few keys on his laptop. "You'll still have full control, just nothing that shows up on a typical audit or divorce disclosure." For the next 2 hours, we reviewed assets line by line. Rental properties, equipment, licensing agreements, revenue shares from long-term municipal projects, every dollar accounted for, then quietly rerouted. I signed documents until my hand cramped, but with each signature, a little more of my life came back into my control. "Margaret ever see any of this?" Marcus asked at one point. "No," I said. "She never cared about how it worked. Just that it worked." He smirked. "Then she's got no idea she's playing with a ghost portfolio." We wrapped around noon. As I stood to leave, Marcus put a hand on the folder. "You sure you want to go down this road?" I looked him in the eye. "She started it. I'm just making sure she doesn't finish it." He nodded once, firm. "Then you're ready." I stepped out into the parking lot, sun glaring down, wind tugging at my collar. The world hadn't changed. But something in me had. For the first time in days, I didn't feel exposed. Margaret and Dan thought they were dealing with a construction guy who didn't know how to protect himself. They didn't realize I'd been building structures my whole life, not just with concrete and steel, but with foresight. Now the strongest one of all was invisible. I didn't know much about the legal world, but I knew plenty about men. And Dan Thompson? He had the hands of a talker, not a builder. Smooth, pale, unscarred by work. The kind of man who wore expensive shoes he hadn't paid for yet. I'd shaken enough hands to know when someone was living on borrowed image. I made a few quiet calls. Construction taught me how to keep ears on the ground. Inspectors, union heads, material suppliers. The blue-collar grapevine never sleeps, especially in a town like ours. By midweek, I had names. By the end of the day, I had the truth. Dan wasn't the polished success story he pretended to be. Behind the perfect teeth and the courtroom swagger was a man drowning in debt. $180,000 in student loans. An $8,500 monthly lease on an office he couldn't afford. Fancy downtown address, leather furniture, and not a single damn payment made on time since last fall. 3 subcontractors, guys I knew from jobs over the years, told me he still owed them money. Bob Martinez from Martinez Electrical was the first to open up. Said Dan had promised payment on a contract dispute, then vanished once the check cleared. He talks fast, Bob said over coffee, voice thick with resentment. But the money never comes. We're not big firms, Alan. We can't eat $5,000 just to keep the lights on. I called Jim Morrison at Morrison Concrete. We poured foundation together when both our companies were run out of garages. He didn't mince words. Dan Thompson's got champagne tastes on a beer budget, he said. He's been stiffing tradespeople for months. Promises payment next week, then ducks your calls. Looks good on paper, but he's a liability. I dug deeper. The State Bar website showed 2 dismissed complaints in the last year. Both trust fund mismanagement. Both swept under the rug, but documented. It all fit. Dan wasn't just unethical. He was desperate. The kind of man who needed my money to cover the holes in his own sinking ship. And Margaret, God help her, had tied herself to a man who was already sinking. I printed everything. Invoices, email chains, complaint records. I wanted it in ink. Not just for me. For what was coming. Because now I didn't just have a betrayal. I had leverage. I sat in my truck that night, parked outside the job site on East Monroe, and stared at the manila folders sitting in the passenger seat. Dan Thompson wanted to steal my life. But he'd left a trail of bad debts and broken promises behind him. And I knew the thing about deception is, it leaves fingerprints. Little smudges in places most people don't look. But I wasn't most people anymore. I was a man who'd spent his life reading fine print on contracts, catching decimal errors in supplier invoices, noticing when someone was padding labor hours on a job site. Margaret's lies were no different. They just wore designer heels. I started with the credit card statements. She never hid them. Never needed to. I was the kind of husband who trusted, who paid the bills on time, no questions asked. But now, every charge felt like a breadcrumb leading to the truth. Spa treatments at noon on Tuesdays, book club, she'd said. Riverside Country Club lunches tagged with Dan's initials. $2,300 to a boutique men's clothing store 3 blocks from Dan's office. And then there were the transfers, $1, $500 here, $2,000 there, always to a joint savings account I didn't recognize. I called Marcus. Does this account show up on any of our joint holdings? I asked. Not one of yours, he said, clicking away on his keyboard. But I found the beneficiary. Let me guess. Daniel Thompson. The words dropped like cement. I kept digging. 8 months of siphoning. $47,000 funneled to that account in tidy little bursts. Never enough to raise alarms, but more than enough to fund private meetings and legal fees. And with each transaction, Margaret was buying their future with money I had earned. I printed every statement. Highlighted every transaction. Labeled them by date. The notes became a timeline, Margaret's descent from wife to conspirator. Back in my office, I pulled out my phone and replayed the recording. Her voice, so casual, so damn confident. He actually believes I love him. This wasn't impulse. It was architecture. Every smile at dinner, every affectionate shoulder squeeze, every time she asked about the company's health, measured, timed, performed. She'd been documenting my empire with surgical precision while I thought I was building a life with her. I opened the drawer beneath my desk and placed every file inside. A growing archive of betrayal. Audio files, scanned receipts, call logs, bank statements. If she wanted a legal war, I'd give her one. But she wasn't walking in with clean hands. Not now. Margaret thought she was stacking the deck. What she didn't realize was that the whole thing sat on a house of cards. And I had just pulled the foundation loose. Exactly where to point when it all came crashing down. Brianna called just after lunch. Her voice was light at first, but too controlled, like someone rehearsing concern before saying it out loud. Hey, Dad, she said. Got a minute? I leaned back in my office chair, staring at the half-finished blueprint on my desk. Always. What's on your mind? There was a pause. The kind where you can hear someone choosing their words. Is everything okay between you and Mom? I smiled faintly, the kind you learn to perfect when pretending everything's fine. That's a loaded question. What makes you ask? Little things, she said. She's been off. Edgy. And Dan's been asking me weird questions about the company, how the business is structured, who owns what. Like he's trying to understand something without just asking you directly. I stayed quiet. let her fill the silence. It didn't take long. Yesterday, Mom said something about feeling financially trapped. She continued. That you've been restricting things. Which doesn't sound like you. And I guess I just... She stopped. I don't know who to believe. It hit me then. She was in the crossfire. Torn between the parents she'd always trusted and a husband who'd built his own kind of influence over the years. I couldn't blame her for asking. She was trained to notice patterns. She saw the cracks before she understood the wall was already crumbling. I appreciate you asking, I said. But things are complicated right now. And sometimes, people try to rewrite a story to protect themselves. Brianna sighed. She asked me for help, Dad. Not as your daughter. She said she wanted my professional opinion. About whether you were controlling. If your behavior felt manipulative. I closed my eyes. She's trying to turn your license into a weapon, I said softly. I haven't given her anything, Brianna replied quickly. I told her I can't make clinical assessments about my own father. And honestly, it didn't feel right. The way she talked. Like she'd already decided the answer and just wanted me to confirm it. I could hear it in her voice, conflict battling loyalty. Guilt warring with doubt. You don't need to pick sides, I told her. Just watch. Keep your eyes open. The truth has a way of showing itself when people think no one's watching. She was quiet for a moment. You're not the one who changed, are you? No, I said. But your mom isn't who we thought she was. I didn't tell her about the recording. Not yet. I didn't mention the money, or Dan's debts, or the $47,000 they'd funneled behind my back. I wanted her to come to it on her own. To see the truth not because I handed it to her, but because she recognized it when it arrived. I trust you, she said finally. But I need to understand what's really going on. I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. You will. Margaret chose their usual brunch spot. Caf Luna. Corner booth. Same place she and Brianna had met every month for 5 years, like clockwork. The server greeted them both by name, but Margaret barely acknowledged him. She was too focused on playing the part. Subtle makeup, loose cardigan, fragile smile. She looked like a woman holding herself together. But Brianna had seen that act before. In clients. In patients. In court-mandated therapy sessions. Bree, Margaret began softly, I need to talk to you. About your father. Brianna stirred her coffee, not looking up. Okay. I think something's wrong with him. Mentally. Emotionally. He's been controlling, paranoid. Financially restrictive. It was said with a tremble, the words fragile enough to crack if Brianna pressed too hard. But she didn't react, not yet. How long has this been going on? She asked. Months. Maybe longer. But it got worse this past week. He froze the accounts. I couldn't even buy lunch yesterday. I think he's trying to punish me. For asking questions. Brianna leaned forward slowly. What questions? Margaret hesitated. Just questions about our marriage. About what's fair. I brought up how things might look if we separated, and he got cold. Distant. Did he threaten you? Not directly. But it felt like intimidation. Like a warning. Brianna took a sip of her drink. Then set it down carefully. You want me to diagnose him, don't you? As a professional. No, Margaret said quickly. Too quickly. Of course not. I'm just worried about his behavior. And I thought maybe you could help me understand it. As a daughter. And as someone trained to see the signs. The signs of what? Brianna asked. Abuse, Margaret whispered. Brianna sat back, watching her. She didn't blink. Didn't offer comfort. Her therapist's tone kicked in, measured, clean, neutral. Mom, do you believe Dad is emotionally abusive? Margaret's eyes shimmered. I didn't want to believe it. But now? And you're asking me to confirm that? To support that in court? No. No. Just if it came to that, I thought your insight might help. Brianna exhaled. Slowly. I can't diagnose someone I haven't evaluated. And I can't ethically testify based on secondhand descriptions from a family member with a stake in the outcome. Margaret's expression faltered. And more importantly, Brianna continued, I haven't seen any behavior from Dad that fits what you're describing. What I have seen is someone trying to protect himself from something he hasn't said out loud yet. Margaret said nothing. Brianna reached for her purse. Mom, if something's going on, you should get legal counsel. But don't ask me to weaponize my credentials. Because I won't lie, for you or for anyone. She stood, her voice quiet but final. If you want someone to validate a lie, you'll have to find someone else. And just like that, the performance ended. Tom Bradley didn't ask many questions. That was one of the reasons I had stayed with First National all these years. He was a banker who understood silence could be more useful than curiosity. We sat in his office, just the two of us, surrounded by polished mahogany and soft lighting. I slid a stack of paperwork across the desk. Authorizations, security directives, access limitation forms. I want everything locked down, I said. Every joint account, every line of credit. Access frozen until identity verification is done in person. With photo ID. No exceptions. Tom glanced over the documents, his brow rising slightly. You want this to hit everything? Everything, I said. I want them to feel it by lunch. His eyes studied mine for a moment. Then he nodded. We'll execute the holds immediately. But you know Margaret will be notified. I'm counting on it. By the time I left the bank, the wheels were already turning. At 11:47 a.m., the freezes took effect. Credit cards declined. Online transfers blocked. ATM access revoked. Any attempt to move a dollar triggered an alert routed to my phone. At 12:03, the first one came in. Declined. Riverside Country Club, $168.45. 12 minutes later, my phone rang. Alan, stay on them, I said. I want to know what's inside that folder before the week's out. Already working on it. I hung up and stared out the office window at the skyline I'd helped build. They thought I was some slow-moving dinosaur, all calloused hands and blind trust. But I'd built skyscrapers from sand. Navigated backroom politics with city planners who'd eat lawyers like Dan alive. They were documenting a fantasy. I was documenting a crime. And I had just put them under a microscope. It started with the country club. Margaret showed up for her usual Friday lunch with the other construction wives, wearing her pearls and that fake smile she'd perfected over the years. But when she walked into the dining room, something shifted. Conversations dipped. Heads turned. A couple of them offered stiff nods. Others didn't look at her at all. Linda Patterson suddenly found her phone fascinating. Susan Morrison excused herself the second Margaret approached the table. By the time Margaret sat down, only Janet Crawford remained, and even she kept her tone brittle and rehearsed. We missed you at the planning committee meeting yesterday. Margaret blinked. What meeting? Oh, Janet said, her voice coated in sugar. Didn't you get the message? We made some last-minute changes. You understand. Margaret did. Her social credit had just been revoked. Word had gotten out, quiet, sharp, the way things always did in a town where reputations are currency. She hadn't just betrayed a husband. She'd violated the unwritten rule of the wives' circle. Don't torch the man funding your lifestyle unless you're ready to burn with him. At the same time, Dan's empire was unraveling one call at a time. 3 major clients had cut ties, citing concerns about discretion. A fourth left a voicemail with his assistant, questioning whether their trust fund had been used appropriately. The State Bar Association had officially launched an ethics review. Not just complaints this time, an active investigation. Dan's paralegal quit on Monday. His junior associate on Wednesday. By Friday, the receptionist stopped answering the phones. I watched it all from a distance, never lifting a finger. Just letting gravity take over. Margaret had chosen ambition over integrity. Dan had gambled on arrogance over ethics. Now they were slipping down the slope, and there wasn't a rope between them. Mike sent me photos from across the street. Dan and Margaret huddled in his office at 9 p.m., blinds only half drawn, heads bent over paperwork. Panic had a posture, and they both wore it like a second skin. One of Margaret's last voicemails to Brianna arrived late that night. She sounded unsteady. Sweetheart, I could really use someone to talk to. It's a little chaotic right now. Maybe we could get coffee? Brianna didn't call back. Margaret had lost more than financial security. She'd lost the only ally who might have still believed in her. And Dan? Well, Dan was running out of places to hide. His charm didn't work on the Bar Association. His legal tricks couldn't erase the paper trail. The storm they conjured was finally overhead. And it was only just beginning to rain. Margaret always knew how to perform under pressure. She'd mastered it early. Tears on cue, tremble in the voice, Vulnerability just sharp enough to twist sympathy into a blade. Now, backed into a corner and bleeding social capital, she dusted off the old tricks for one last performance. Dan coached her through it. His office was dim and cluttered, documents spread across the table like a war map. He wore his courtroom face, stern and controlled, but his eyes were frantic. The bar investigation was tightening, and Margaret was his only shot at regaining leverage. "This is how we regain control," he said, tapping a blank petition. "We file for a restraining order, emergency protection, emotional abuse, financial intimidation, psychological manipulation." Margaret hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "But he's never laid a hand on me." "That's not the point," Dan snapped. "Abuse isn't just physical. We frame the financial restrictions as coercive control. The frozen accounts become evidence. The withdrawn access, the closed credit lines, that's isolation. You're trapped. You're scared." She looked up, voice small. "I am scared." Dan leaned in, softening. "Then say that. Say it in court. With conviction. Make them believe you're a woman afraid of the man she's loved for 25 years. She nodded slowly, like a reluctant heroine in a drama she hadn't auditioned for, but it was all part of the act. The last card in the deck. And it might have worked if they hadn't already shown their hand. By Monday morning, the restraining order petition was filed with the county clerk. Claims of controlling behavior, emotional volatility, sudden and aggressive financial retaliation. They didn't know I was already waiting. My attorney, James Morrison, called me at 9:15 a.m., voice low and sharp. "They're trying to flip the narrative," he said. "Emergency hearing. They're painting you as abusive, paranoid. We've been served." I didn't flinch. "Let them." James paused. "You're sure? Play the tape," I said. "If they want a courtroom, I'll give them one. Just make sure the judge has the full version." Across town, Margaret rehearsed her lines in Dan's car. She wore a conservative dress. Minimal makeup. Hands wringing just enough to look natural. "You're not an angry wife," Dan reminded her. "You're a terrified woman finding the courage to escape your abuser." She nodded, and together they walked into the courthouse, thinking they still held a pen. They didn't know the script had already been rewritten. And this time, the truth had the lead role. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not the temperature, something in the air. The kind of chill that settles when truth and performance are about to collide. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore gray. Not black, it would have looked too staged, but just enough to suggest grief. Her eyes were glassy, lips pale. She looked like the picture of a woman barely holding it together. I almost believed it myself. Dan sat beside her, posture perfect, whispering last-minute strategy. He didn't look at me once. Probably couldn't. Judge Hendricks entered briskly, robes swaying behind her like a curtain rising on the first act. She was known for cutting through theatrics, and today, she'd have a front-row seat. "Mrs. Cole," the judge began, her voice clipped, professional. "You're seeking a temporary restraining order against your husband on the grounds of emotional and financial abuse. Please state the basis for this request." Margaret cleared her throat, eyes brimming on cue. "Your Honor, over the past several months, my husband has become increasingly controlling. He's frozen our accounts, restricted my access to funds, monitored my movements. I no longer feel safe." The performance was flawless. Measured pauses. Voice trembles. The courtroom leaned in. Margaret had always been good at reading a room. "Thank you," the judge said. Then she turned to our side. "Mr. Morrison, does the defense wish to respond?" James stood slowly. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. He clicked a small remote, and the courtroom's audio system buzzed to life. "Your Honor," he said, "we would like to present recorded evidence relevant to the petition." The first voice that played was Dan's, confident, cutting. "File in June. Irreconcilable differences. With the new statutes, she gets half, plus support for life." Then Margaret. "The man actually believes I love him." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, like wine through dry leaves. The judge's expression didn't change, but I saw her eyes harden. For 43 minutes, they listened. To the timeline. The asset strategy. The laughter. The mockery. The lies. When the audio ended, silence fell so thick it seemed to mute even the outside world. Judge Hendricks looked at Margaret, who now sat pale and rigid, hands frozen in her lap. Dan had stopped whispering. His face was blank, but his jaw twitched.
Mrs. Cole,
the judge said slowly.
Do you have any explanation for this recording?
Margaret opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her attorney leaned over to whisper, but the damage was done. The narrative had collapsed mid-sentence. James spoke one last time.
Your Honor, we request immediate dismissal of this petition, with prejudice.
Granted, the judge said, voice like a gavel before it even fell.
This court will also refer the matter to the district attorney for review.
Margaret flinched. Dan stared straight ahead. And I sat still, calm, while the truth echoed in the aftermath. Margaret didn't move when the judge announced the referral. She just sat there, blinking like the lights had suddenly gone too bright. The courtroom murmured behind her, but her world had gone quiet. Everything she'd built, her story, her performance, her leverage, lay in ruins at her feet. Her attorney, Linda Hawthorne, leaned in with a forced whisper, but Margaret barely responded. Linda straightened, smoothed her jacket, and stood.
Your Honor,
she said, voice sharp and clean.
In light of the evidence presented and the lack of disclosure from my client, I respectfully request permission to withdraw from representation.
Judge Hendricks didn't blink.
Granted. Please ensure your withdrawal is properly documented. You are excused.
Margaret's mouth opened slightly, but Linda was already collecting her files, face stiff, eyes avoiding her clients. She hadn't signed up for perjury. And now she wanted no part of it. Margaret turned slowly toward Dan. He didn't meet her gaze. He was already pulling his phone from his pocket, typing furiously, damage control. Or maybe checking to see how far the fallout had reached. The judge cleared her throat and looked at the bailiff.
Ensure the recording and transcript are submitted to the district attorney's office today. I want confirmation of delivery. Yes, Your Honor.
Then she looked at me. Not with sympathy. Not with apology. Just a quiet nod of recognition. A man betrayed? A man who brought the truth into a courtroom filled with lies. The gavel came down. Margaret rose on trembling legs, like she wasn't sure if they'd hold her. Her pearls shifted awkwardly against the neckline of her dress, too tight, too staged. She was still wearing the costume, but the stage had collapsed. Outside the courtroom, she stood frozen in the corridor, staring at the floor. I walked past her without stopping. Without a word. She didn't speak either. There was nothing left to say. Dan was on the phone near the elevators, pacing. His voice was low and urgent. I didn't need to hear the words. I already knew the tone. He was trying to outrun something that was already on his heels. Later that day, the call came from James.
The DA is reviewing. They won't say yet if they'll press charges, but perjury is on the table. And with the recording?
He paused.
They'd have to be blind not to pursue it.
I nodded.
Good.
It wasn't about revenge. Not anymore. It was about watching the truth stand on its own, after being buried under so many layers of rehearsed betrayal. Margaret had thought she was untouchable. That she could lie, manipulate, and walk away with half my life. Now she might walk away with a criminal record. The collapse had begun. And there was no scaffolding left to hold it up. Dan's name came off the state bar register 2 weeks after the hearing. No ceremony. No grace period. Just a 1-paragraph email from the Iowa Board of Professional Responsibility.
License suspended pending permanent revocation.
The complaint had grown teeth. Misuse of client trust funds, 3 subcontractors willing to testify, and a trail of bank transfers that read like a confession. It didn't matter how slick his motions were, or how many hours he'd spent in courtrooms over the years. The system that once protected him now spit him out. He didn't show up for the ethics hearing. Sent a letter instead. Cited stress. Overwork. Mistakes in judgment. But there was no sympathy left to cash in. Last I heard, Dan packed up and moved to Nebraska. Word is he's working at a small claims office as a paralegal. No license, no clients, no future. Just a man who bet everything on someone else's marriage and lost. Brianna came to my office the day after the restraining order hearing. She didn't knock. She just walked in, stood across from me, and said,
"I've filed."
I looked up from my desk.
"You sure?"
Her eyes were clear. Cold, but calm.
"He used my name, my training, my career. Tried to turn me into a weapon against my own father. That's not something you forgive."
I didn't argue. I just nodded. She sat down quietly and placed a folder on the desk. Inside, her signed divorce petition. A clean cut. No games. No threats.
I want you to know, she said. I don't blame myself for not seeing it. But I'll never let it happen again.
I didn't say anything. Just reached across the desk and squeezed her hand. That was enough. As for Margaret, she didn't fight the settlement. Not after the perjury referral. Not after her attorney abandoned her in open court. The prenuptial agreement, the one she'd signed without blinking in 1987, kicked in like a silent witness waiting all these years to be useful. She walked away with exactly what she brought into the marriage. Nothing. The Lexus was repossessed. The country club revoked her membership.
Pending review.
The fundraising board removed her name from next month's gala program. Social circles that once called her darling now closed their doors with polite, icy distance. I saw her once, months later. At the mall. She was behind the counter at one of those boutique perfume shops. Black polo, name tag, fake smile. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did, and just didn't want to. Either way, I kept walking. She traded a life of security and respect for a gamble built on lies. Now she stood beneath fluorescent lights, selling other people's illusions for minimum wage. And I finally had peace. The house felt bigger now. Not empty, just quieter. Honest. I'd always thought silence was something you filled, but now I understood it could be something you earned. There were no more staged conversations echoing through the kitchen, no footsteps I second-guessed down the hallway. Just the soft hum of the fridge, the creak of old floorboards, the sound of rain tapping gently against the windows I'd installed with my own hands in '95. I kept the recliner Margaret hated. Planted it right in the center of the living room, like a monument to stubbornness. Or survival. Maybe both. At Cole Construction, things never slowed down. If anything, they picked up. Word of what I'd been through traveled faster than steel delivery delays. But not as gossip, more like quiet respect. Old partners reached out. Subcontractors I hadn't heard from in years called to check in. Even the mayor stopped by the job site one morning with coffee and a handshake that lingered longer than usual.
Glad to see you still standing, Alan, he said. You've built too much of this town to let a storm knock you over.
I smiled at that. Because he wasn't wrong. The crew treated me differently, too. Not softer, just steadier. Like they understood something had been tested and hadn't cracked. I rebuilt my office first. Cleaned out the files Margaret used to
help organize.
Repainted the walls myself one weekend. Swapped out the old family photo for a framed quote my father used to mutter under his breath during hard seasons. Measure twice. Cut once. Trust less. Brianna came by often. She didn't bring sympathy. She brought herself, calm, grounded, a little sharper now, but still my daughter. We talked more than we had in years. About business. About psychology. About boundaries, and how they don't have to be fences, just clear lines drawn with care. She offered to refer me to someone.
Not a therapist, just a good sounding board,
she said. I told her maybe. One day. But for now, the quiet was working just fine. I started cooking again. Mornings with black coffee and real bacon. Evenings with the news playing low and a good book open on the table. It was simple, but it was mine. Not curated, not performative. No audience. No script. For the first time in decades, I wasn't rushing toward a milestone or dragging anyone with me. I was just here. Breathing. Thinking. Living. They had tried to take everything, my name, my company, my daughter, my peace. But all they did was strip away the noise. Now I could hear myself again. And the sound was steady. It's a strange thing, walking through a house you once thought was filled with love, only to realize most of it was performance. The curated warmth, the practiced affection, the way she used to light candles on Friday nights like it meant something. Now, I see it for what it was. A stage. And I was just the man funding the set. But the walls are still standing. The home didn't collapse with the marriage. And neither did I. I've stopped wondering how much of it was real. That's a hole you could fall into and never crawl out of. Instead, I ask better questions now. What do I know to be true? What can I build from here? The truth, as it turns out, is quieter than love. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't dress itself up. It just is. And once you get past the sting of betrayal, you start to crave that honesty like oxygen. I keep a copy of the court transcript in my desk drawer. Not out of spite. Not as a trophy. Just a reminder. A map of how far someone will go when they believe you're too trusting to see the knife coming. But it also reminds me of something else. How far I came once I did. Margaret hasn't reached out since the settlement. Neither has Dan. I suspect they've each found new stories to play roles in. People like that don't change. They just find a different stage. And I've stopped waiting for an apology that would have only been another performance. Brianna is thriving. Her practice is growing. She's strong, sharper now, but still kind. We talk every Sunday without fail. Not because we have to, but because we want to. She tells me about her clients, the ones who remind her too much of Mom. I listen. And I understand more than I ever used to. Sometimes I catch myself remembering the good moments. Vacations, holidays, quiet dinners where we laughed about things I can't even recall now. And I don't push those memories away. They were real, even if the person sharing them with me wasn't. That's the cruel trick of betrayal. It doesn't erase what was good. It just changes what it meant. But I'm not bitter. I'm grounded. I'm clear. And I'm free. The house is quieter now, but not hollow. It's filled with things that are mine, not bought to impress anyone or decorate a life that wasn't real, but chosen because they speak to who I am. Books I actually read. Chairs I actually sit in. A kitchen where I cook for one and never feel alone. I know the difference now. Between love and performance. And I choose the truth. Every damn time.